Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan Lapierre. This week, understanding the clash at the border. Is there a Remain in Mexico agreement or not? And are we headed for a government shutdown over border wall funding? All that just ahead. But before we get started, please remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcast. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today is the full panel. Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
Laura Hall, Senior Manager at BPC Action. Hi, Laura.
Hi, happy to be here.
And Cris Ramón, Policy Analyst. Hey, Cris.
Hey, Jordan.
First up today, many of us spent part of the Thanksgiving holiday trying to make sense of the scene on the U.S. Mexico border at the San Isidro crossing near San Diego. Cris, what happened?
Basically, what happened is there was a group of about 500 individuals who were approaching the San Isidro border crossing, which is near San Diego, on the border between California and Tijuana. They were initially peaceful protests, but basically at a certain point, they began to try to cross the border. In order to cross the border, they overcame Mexican federal police that were stationed there. And after they overcame that, they tried to cross the border. There were reports indicating that some of them threw rocks at CBP officers who were amassed at the border, and then that subsequently led CBP to fire tear gas at two locations, one of them which was directly due east of the main border crossing and another one due west. One of the reports then indicated that, the tear gas carried off into Mexico, and that essentially dispersed the individuals who had been amassed there. Then U.S. authorities subsequently closed the border at San Isidro, prevented all crossings through the afternoon, and then reopened it that evening. So that's more or less just a sort of a play-by-play of what was reported and then sort of what happened that afternoon.
Cris, you're always tracking public reaction to these big moments. How do people here in the U.S. and maybe more interestingly in Mexico respond to what happened?
So U.S. reaction was mixed. Obviously, individuals who are more oriented towards what immigration advocates have been saying, were saying that this is a direct attack on these individuals, that they shouldn't be tear gassing women and children, and they were outraged by what they saw. Individuals who might be a little bit more in line with what the administration has been saying is that this was, people were provoking this response. They were trying to cross into the country illegally. And for them, they felt that this was sort of justified. And in some instances, they felt that in the instances that there were women and children at that scene, that they shouldn't have brought their children with them. So that's U.S. opinion. Mexican opinion has been, obviously mixed as well. I think the Mexican government, their reaction has been pretty interesting because they will actually detain and deport at least 39 individuals who participated in the incident on Sunday. And then popular opinion sort of seems to be mixed. I think a lot of Mexicans, especially those along the border towns and especially in Tijuana, aren't particularly happy to have this large number of individuals from these caravans there. There have been anti-immigrant protests from these communities. So I think that they not necessarily won't welcome this, but I think that it raises the profile of their concerns about having this many number of foreigners in their cities. So that's what we're seeing in Mexico as well.
We're going to talk in depth about the thorny issue of funding DHS later in the show. But Laura, I want to bring you in here and ask, will this incident have any impact on how those negotiations play out over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I'm not sure it does too much. The one thing I will say is President Trump is feeling pretty strongly that he would like $5 billion for his border wall. I think this scene, these images coming out of the border at San Isidro kind of reinforces his point that things are kind of chaotic down there, that they need a wall, that we need some kind of protection against these folks that are throwing rocks and storming the border. So if anything, I think it might strengthen the president's hand a bit of the importance of his $5 billion for the wall.
All right, after the break, deal or no deal? We're back. The incident in San Ysidro follows news that the Trump administration is trying to broker a deal with the Mexican government that would allow non-Mexican citizens to stay in Mexico while the U.S. processes their asylum claims. But the Mexican government says they have no such deal. So, Theresa, what's the status of this so-called Remain in Mexico agreement, whether it exists or not?
So the important thing to understand is that the government in Mexico is about to change. On December 1st, the new government of López Obrador comes in, and the current government of Enrique Peña Nieto goes out. The negotiations supposedly have been between the incoming government and the United States. Well, of course, the incoming government, not being installed yet, has no authority to actually make a deal. So there will be no deal until the incoming administration takes power. So it's tentative to the extent that there exists a deal.
Let's say that the tentative deal becomes a reality. How would it work?
So the concept is that immigrants who come to the United States who actually make an asylum claim after they have filed their claim, instead of being released into the United States to wait their day in immigration court, would be sent back to Mexico to wait in Mexico. Now, as we know, immigration courts are terribly backlogged, and many of these cases take 2 to 3 years before they can come up. And the administration has been very upset about this so-called catch and release policy that has required them to release families in the United States. So this would basically be an antidote to that from the Trump administration's point of view, saying, well, we'll let you apply for asylum, but you're going to have to wait it out in Mexico.
There are, though, international laws pertaining to the rights of asylees and how the asylum process is supposed to work. So I guess the big question is, would this be legal?
Well, that is a question. There is a provision of U.S. immigration law that says that for immigrants who are not admissible to the United States and put in removal proceedings, if they come from contiguous territory, they can be made to wait in that contiguous territory for their proceedings. We have never used this provision, and mainly because we have never had agreements with Mexico or Canada to accept people who aren't Mexican or Canadian to do this. The key question here is whether this provision applies equally to those seeking asylum. Asylum advocates would say it would not, particularly if there's any danger to these immigrants while they are in Mexico. So there is an international agreement that says that we cannot return a migrant to a place where they would suffer harm. We certainly could not return them back to their country that they're claiming asylum from unless their asylum is denied. If Mexico were to allow them to stay but then later deport them back, the United States could be seen as responsible under international law. So I would definitely expect a court challenge to this if it does come through, but it would be an interesting legal discussion.
Okay, I want to jump on a small tangent here for a second and give you a chance to bust one of your favorite myths that folks around the world can go to their nearest U.S. embassy and claim asylum there. True or false?
False. So this is something that has come up as this caravan has moved through Mexico. There's been a lot of people on social media and other places. I've even heard it on national news programs saying they don't have to come to the border. They could just have gone to the nearest consulate and applied there, or they could mail their asylum application and wait at home. That is absolutely 100% not true. In order to apply for asylum, you must be at the United States border or in the United States. The United States does not accept asylum applications at any of its consulates or embassies around the world. People who are not in the United States who wish to be processed through the refugee program can only do so if they come through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and are referred to the United States. So asylum is strictly for people once they arrive here. We don't currently have a UNHCR processing program for refugees in Central America or in Mexico. So that is why the only option for individuals who wanted to apply for asylum in the United States is to try to get here.
That brings up another important point. There's a difference between applying for refugee status and applying for asylum. Can you explain what the two statuses mean?
Exactly. They're similar in that the requirements for both are the same and they come out of the international conventions. A refugee or an asylee is someone who is afraid to return or stay in their country due to persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. That is the definition. The difference between an asylee and a refugee: an asylee is someone who applies for that status after arriving in a country. A refugee is somebody who is outside, is processed for that status, and then resettled into the country by the government.
There's also another term floating around that those of us who aren't experts in this space maybe don't quite understand, and it's called safe third country. What is that, and how is that different from this plan that we're proposing with Mexico?
Sure. So, as I said, under U.S. asylum law, anybody who arrives at the United States or is in the United States, whether or not they come at a port of entry, is entitled to ask for asylum. There are a couple of exceptions to that, one of which is they can be denied the opportunity to apply for asylum if they can be sent back to what is called a safe third country. That is a country that the United States has an agreement with to return these nationals that meets certain standards in their own asylum system. Essentially, the rule would say that you should apply for asylum in the first safe country you could go to. If we have such an agreement, we agree that their system meets these international standards, we could return them there. We do not have such an agreement with Mexico. We do have an agreement with Canada in that the United States is a safe third country for Canada and vice versa, but we do not have an agreement with Mexico. The remain in place agreement that's being negotiated is different from safe third. Remain in place would apply only after they have applied for asylum already in the United States.
Cris, I want to go back to some of the things that Theresa talked about at the beginning here with a new incoming government in Mexico and questions about what the relationship will be between the United States and Mexico moving forward. How do you see this negotiation or this lack of negotiation maybe impacting those relationships?
Sure. So when this plan, or at least reports about the plan, were being reported in the U.S., the idea was that there was already a deal in place, and then subsequently the Mexican government rejected that and said, no, there is no deal in place. What we do know and what's been reported is that there are discussions with the incoming Mexican government. The inauguration for the new Mexican government is December 1st, and so then they'll be assuming power. There will be negotiations or discussions between Vice President Pence and the new President López Obrador on Saturday, it's December 1st, as well as a meeting with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo with the incoming Foreign Secretary December 2nd or later on this week. So that's sort of where the discussions are towards this. In terms of broader U.S.-Mexican relations, this is going to be a little bit tricky because, obviously the United States and Mexico have built up a stronger rapport on cooperation with security and some border management as well over the last 15 years or so. But what we're dealing with is also the internal politics of Mexico. López Obrador came in as a strong left-wing candidate who said he would stand up to the United States. And so, he's going to have to thread the needle very carefully between trying to work with the United States and have a cooperative stance with President Trump and Congress, but also be able to have a stance that can sort of appease his supporters. So it's going to be a very, very tricky negotiation, not only between the United States and Mexico, but within Mexico for the incoming Mexican government.
Finally, if this Remain in Mexico plan did happen, how would it impact Mexico's asylum system? And maybe more fundamentally, are Mexican border towns prepared for this?
So as we discussed on this podcast and in the work that we've done here at BPC, that the Mexican asylum system has received a significant number of asylum applications from individuals, including individuals from Central America who form the caravans who've been arriving to the country. If the Remain in Mexico plan comes in, it could be the case that more individuals will just simply say, you know what, we're done trying to seek asylum in the United States. We're going to try to seek asylum in Mexico. And that can be problematic because the number's already high, but the fact is that Mexico, the number of personnel of asylum officers they have to process all these claims is very low, and the backlog is significant. So it could push a very fragile system over the brink. If you're looking at border communities, this is also where it becomes problematic, because if the plan's in place and more people are amassing at the U.S. Mexico border, a lot of these communities, including Tijuana, for instance, some of them do have facilities to be able to host migrants. But the thing is that resources for these facilities are already running low. There isn't enough space. And as I mentioned earlier in this podcast, that there is sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that's starting to spread through these cities. I would say that's not unlike what you saw during the European refugee crisis in the Balkans and in Greece, where more individuals are started amassing coming in from Syria, for instance, and people sort of saying enough is enough. We don't want these foreigners here. We don't want these refugees here. and then sort of engage in anti-immigrant activity. So you could sort of see a similar situation coming up here.
All right. In a moment, is a shutdown around the corner? Okay, let's close today with the latest drama on Capitol Hill. DHS funding is one of the biggest items on the agenda for Congress's lame duck session before the end of this year. But President Trump has been signaling again that he may not approve a funding package if it doesn't include money for a border wall. Laura, you're our eyes and ears on the Hill. What are you hearing about where things stand?
Yeah, well, funding for several government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, is set to expire on December 7th. So Congress must act in some manner before the 7th or face a partial shutdown. President Trump wants $5 billion for his border wall. Democrats and some Republicans aren't on board with that. There was an agreement, kind of discussion earlier this year where Democrats said they'd be open to $1.6 billion. We don't know what's happening behind closed doors, but for now, they're publicly sticking to that claim that $1.6 billion is as far as they'll go. So there are several kind of ways out of this box here. One option is certainly a partial shutdown, where the president and Congress can't come to an agreement on a path forward, and some government agencies and individuals shut down. Another option, I guess, is everyone gets the $5 billion for the wall and we kind of move forward and say happy holidays. I think that's unlikely. But then kind of the middle ground is a potential compromise I'm hearing discussed, dividing the funding over 2 years. So $2.5 billion for the wall this year, $2.5 billion next year. Everyone can kind of claim a victory and call it a day. Right now, it's a bunch of trade-offs and negotiations and back and forth and all that kind of stuff that's happening up there. And we just really don't know what the outcome might be right now.
I just want to add that there's one other difference between where the White House is and where Democrats are. The White House is saying that this $5 billion is for the wall. Democrats are saying, no, we agreed on $1.6 billion for border security other than the wall. And President Trump in a recent interview said, no, there's other monies that he wants for other border security, but the $5 billion is just for the wall. So defining what this money is for will also be part of this negotiated bargain, I'm sure.
Yes, very much so.
And Theresa, we published what feels like a lifetime ago, but was really only about a year ago, in late 2017, a roadmap to a DACA deal. And for all that's changed in immigration in the last year, the contours of that deal are still in place and might come into play in these negotiations. Walk me through that.
So more than a year ago, after the president decided he wanted to terminate the DACA program and asked Congress to try to come up with a legislative solution, our task force came together and said, look, the fundamental deal that's obvious here is giving permanent status to the DACA population, to the Dreamers, in exchange for border security and possibly even the wall. And that still, I think, is the fundamentals of what could be a rather simple deal. I won't say easy, but a simple deal, because nothing in Congress is easy. That having been said, the reason that this didn't happen, that Congress tried twice this past year to pass DACA legislation that included money for wall funding, and both times it failed. In part because the White House decided, in addition to those things, they also wanted to do things that would cut legal immigration, including family immigration, the diversity lottery. Other folks came in and said, we actually want to increase enforcement by penalizing sanctuary cities or removing the so-called loopholes at the border that allow families to be released while they're waiting their asylum claims. And those provisions were not ones that would be accepted by a lot of the Democrats. So I think looking forward to this fall, yes, the simple deal of DACA for border is still out there, but there's a lot of considerations as to whether or not that could happen, one, in this lame duck, and two, whether it would be that simple or there'd be other things that would be added in.
Yeah, I think some folks on the left are asking, why try to do a deal on immigration now when Democrats are just weeks away from taking the gavel in the House? But there are other prominent advocates who are saying now is as good a time as any. Why are they so in favor of acting?
So I think there's two things here. One is sort of the politics for Democrats. Certainly Democrats, when they control the House in the early next year, will have a stronger hand and stronger leverage with the administration to get what may be a better deal. But they are still going to have to negotiate with a Republican leadership in the Senate and with the Trump White House on whatever they may want to get. So whether or not a deal could be struck this fall is going to depend a lot on many Republican members who are not going to come back in January and where they would want to vote. Whether the leadership is willing to take that deal now. Immigration advocates, I think, are somewhat split. I think there's uncertainty about whether there might be an opportunity to get a better deal next year, or you may still get no deal next year. Why not try for something this year? And if it can happen, great. So I think we'll see. I'm sure DACA will come up. The president also, though, recently said something again in a recent interview where he says that he doesn't see the need for Congress to act on DACA until the Supreme Court weighs in on the court case. And many have said that they think that Congress would be able to duck this issue until the Supreme Court weighs in. A lot of people believe the Supreme Court will say that the DACA program can end. At that point, the status of all of those DACA recipients then becomes very much an issue, and there might be more pressure on Congress to act. That might come next summer. We don't know exactly when. There's still a lot of lower court cases to go, but that's sort of the dynamic at play. Is there a bird in the hand that we could take now? We don't know, but there might be. And if there, or is there one that we could get next year that might be better when everybody feels some more pressure?
And I'll just add in too, while our podcast is very much focused on immigration, the Democrats as a whole have a pretty crowded agenda for the new Congress. Some of these new members got elected on protecting the Affordable Care Act or dealing with infrastructure, election and campaign finance reform is high on the Democrats' priority list. So doing something now on DACA would check an item off their to-do list.
Okay, Laura, Theresa, Cris, thanks so much for joining me, and thanks to you all for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This Week in Immigration is written by Cris Ramón and myself and produced by Emily Schrader. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.